All right, this is the end of chapter 24. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start on your back page of your outline where it lists all the New Deal programs. It lists the first New Deal and it lists the second New Deal. So let's highlight some of those real fast. 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. Remember, all of these have really go by just the letters called alphabet soup. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men in public works project, trying to get them out to the west into parks to build trails and to clean up the wilderness and stuff. And the idea is just creating jobs for these young men. And then they're going to get paid $33 a month, and the purpose of that is to obviously send that money back to their families. They also get room and board, so there's really no other costs for them working in these different projects. In 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, this is eventually going to be called unconstitutional. We've already touched on this a little bit, but the idea is to pay the farmer to reduce the amount of crops, and it's funded by a processing tax. And so we're going to raise taxes on the food processor, but give that money back to the farmer in order to not grow crops and hopefully bring up the prices of those crops. The TVA, 1933, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the idea here is to construct water and dam projects in the Tennessee Valley Authority, or Tennessee Valley, and to prevent erosion in the Tennessee Valley. Understand that in the 1930s, the Tennessee Valley was one of the very few parts of the country that had no electricity at all. They were still living really like they did in the 1700s, and so the idea is to bring power into the Tennessee Valley and to modernize the Tennessee Valley. 1933, the Banking Act of 1933 created the FDIC. The FDIC stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And we talked about the importance of banks and the importance of people having money in banks, because what happens is banks use that money and then give that money out, not give that money out, but loan that money out to people. And the banks make money with interest rates. But what this does for the economy is that the economy, or people will use those loans to buy high-ticket items, such as cars and homes and land and all sorts of different projects. And so whenever people are buying a car, it's not just affecting the auto industry, it's affecting the glass industry and the steel industry, and it's putting all those people back to work. And so banks need to be able to lend out money. Back then, your money was insured up to $5,000. Today, your money is insured up to $100,000. In 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act established the NRA, which we'll talk about, or which we've already talked about. The NRA is going to wind up being called unconstitutional as well. And it's a series of fair competition codes for businesses. The argument against this is that the government is overstepping its bounds by controlling businesses within a state, not businesses that go between states. And that power is only given to the states. In 1933, the National Recovery Administration regulated industry codes, and again, this is going to be a major issue with the states because it's really up to the states to regulate that intrastate commerce. In 1933, the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, provided federal jobs to the unemployed, even if you have to create jobs. We're going to be talking about Keynesian economics. And the idea with Keynesian economics is that if you create jobs, people will have jobs, people will make money. When people make money, they spend that money. When people spend that money, they buy stuff. When they buy stuff, that creates more jobs because you have to produce more things. The second New Deal, 1935, starting in 1935. This is really Roosevelt's second term now, and he comes up with this plan for the second New Deal. Not comes up with a plan, but introduces this plan during his first inaugural speech. First State of the Union speech. 1935, the National Youth Administration, kind of the same thing as we've talked about with other programs, but this time getting young people, getting teenagers into work. one of the major problems is you don't want thousands and thousands of young people just roaming the streets, because we know that nothing good can happen in that. We know about you teenagers, and we need to keep you off the streets. 1935, the Banking Act created a 7-man board to regulate the nation's money supply and interest rates. And so now we're trying to avoid banks having these interest rates wars against each other, and putting other banks out of business, and just also encouraging people to borrow money when they really shouldn't be borrowing money. 1938, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the second one, increased the government regulation of crop production and payment to farmers. Also, 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established for the first time a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour. Remember, before minimum wage, factories would pay as little as possible. And so with a minimum wage, workers had to get paid at least 40 cents an hour. It also set a maximum work week of 40 hours per week. You could work past that, but if you worked past 40 hours a week, that meant that you were getting overtime, and factories don't like that. Businesses don't like paying out overtime. It also prohibited children under the age of 16 from factory work. Okay, I'm going to scroll down a little bit because we have covered the rest of this in class. All right, Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist, and what he proposed was this idea of deficit spending. The idea of the government going into debt to create jobs and to get people back to work. And the more people we get back to work, the more they're going to have money in their pockets, and when they have money in their pockets, they're going to buy stuff, and we've already talked about this, which is going to spin up production, and more people will have jobs. Democrats tend to like Keynesian economics, so make sure you tie Keynesian economics to Democrats. Now, Republicans don't like Keynesian economics because they're not real thrilled about going into debt, and so make sure you tie Keynesian economics really to the Democrats. Okay. Keynes said that it's going to help in several different ways. First of all, it's going to help farmers and sharecroppers to buy their own farms and to keep their own farms. We passed different programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is going to wind up helping farmers be able to grow, or be able to get a fair wage for their, not a fair wage, but a fair price for their crops. Secondly, the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, extends electricity to rural areas. By 1941, 40% of all farms had electricity. Most people in the cities had electricity, and so again, trying to extend that electricity. Probably the best kind of comparison to that today is extending Wi-Fi into places that otherwise can't get Wi-Fi. So we're probably going to over the next few years see something like that again. Also, for labor, the National Labor Relations Act, it encouraged collective bargaining rights for workers. It permitted closed shops for workers, so it's protecting unions. And it also outlawed management practices that would spy on unions and blacklist anybody who was in a union or led a union. And so it's really protecting unions and the right for unions to exist. And then the Social Security Act. This is the start of Social Security, old age pensions, survivors' benefits for victims. If you work in a job for so many years, you're going to get a certain percentage back to you. You pay into Social Security during the years that you work, and then you are going to get money during or after your retirement. In this way, the idea is that it keeps old people from, or the elderly from, being totally destitute. No, there's no health insurance included in this. We'll talk about health insurance at a later time. This does not include people like farmers or domestic workers, people who work for themselves. This only includes people who are getting a paycheck and paying taxes to the federal government. All right, the election of 36. Republican who ran against Roosevelt was a guy named Alfred Landon from Kansas. He's a progressive, but only progressive socially. He was fiscally conservative, does not like this idea of going into debt. We showed you the electoral map of 36, and FDR carried every state except for Maine and Vermont. And the Democrats now control all of the House, all of the Senate by pretty strong majorities, which means that Roosevelt's going to be able to do whatever, okay, not whatever he wants, but he's going to have a wide leeway on what he can and cannot do. After winning the election of 36, Roosevelt feels very confident about himself. And now he's going after the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court ruled against him with Chapt versus the United States. It also ruled against him with the NRA and the AAA. And so Roosevelt is not real thrilled about this conservative Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has 9 justices, and Roosevelt wants to try to dilute the power of the Supreme Court. In 1937, of the 9 justices, 4 of those justices were very, very, very conservative, with only a couple liberals on the court. And so in 37, FDR proposed court reform. He said for every justice over the age of 70, the president would be able to appoint another justice, up to 6 justices. So we could have potentially up to 15 justices on the Supreme Court. Now, this never got passed, but in the end, Roosevelt winds up surviving everybody, and between 37 and 39, he got to appoint 4 new justices to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court swings, not very liberal, but swings more up to the liberal side. Unemployment, obviously, we've talked about this over and over again. Someone asked John Maynard Keynes if he was aware of any historical era compared to the Great Depression. He said yes. It was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted for 400 years. Unemployment in the 1930s was never below 14%. Put that in perspective, when this is recorded, this is 2014, and the unemployment rate right now is right around 6.6%. So we're just coming out of the recession. So it was never below 14%, and frequently is up to about 25%. For whites, for minority groups, that number is much, much, much higher, even up to 2/3 of the minority population. In the 1960s, we pretty much determined in the 1960s anything above 5% unemployment was not tolerable. So we need to do something if unemployment goes above 5%. In places like Cleveland, Akron, and Toledo, Ohio, Cleveland had 50% unemployment, Akron, Ohio 60%, and Toledo, Ohio 80% unemployment rate. So what do you do with all these people who are unemployed? All these people who are fighting and will do anything for jobs. A lot of these people, you know, if you have 80% unemployment or even 50% unemployment, there is no hope for you to find any sort of job, any way to supply money to your family. And so many people, day after day, would get dressed up for work and have no work to go to, and they would just wander the streets, almost compulsively wander the streets, looking for some chance at some work. Most people couldn't sleep at night. Many people hid out because, remember, this is a very proud group of people. These people have made it through the Great War. These people have struggled to make a better life for not only themselves but their families. And now these breadwinners are not bringing in money for the family. They really saw poverty as a personal favor. These people have grown up with this idea, this American idea, that if you work hard enough, you're going to make it. And now these people are working as hard as they can for as long as they can, and there's just no chance of them making it. Now, part of the results of this is actually shown in declining marriage and birth rates. During the Great Depression, if people are that out of work and that poor, they're not really thrilled about starting a family. They're not really thrilled about taking on a marriage partner who they're going to have to take care of them. And they're certainly not willing to have kids for more mouths to feed. And so the population grew for the first time since the early 1920s at less than 1 million people a year, which is about half of the growth rate of the 1920s. In 1938, there was 1.6 million fewer kids under the age of 10 than there were in 1928. And so just a lot fewer kids out there, which, of course, as we roll into the 1940s, not really going to be an issue, but all of a sudden in the 1950s, we're going to have this huge baby boom, and it's going to be a major change in society. And so many of these people, just out of sheer desperation, are turning to public entities, are turning to the government, are turning to churches, are turning to anywhere where they can get help. And this is just so different than what they are used to, and so such a strange idea to have to get help from somebody else. Now, as much as the Great Depression hurt whites, we need to take a look at minority groups because they really suffered. During the Roaring '20s, when it was roaring for the whites, it's not really roaring for minority groups. 1932, 2/3, 65, 66% of the black population were out of work. Now remember, most blacks since the Civil War were in the Republican Party as a thank you to Abraham Lincoln for freeing the slaves and getting rid of slavery, and to the Republican Party for granting citizenship and granting voting rights for blacks. And so blacks had consistently, since 1865, voted for actually 1866, voted for the Republican Party. However, in 1932, that tide is changing because now with the New Deal, it appears that the Democrats are going to be helping out poor people. The whole idea of the New Deal is to get poor people back to work. And certainly when you take a look at poor people, minorities, especially blacks, are in that group. And so one black editor wrote, "My friends, go turn Lincoln's picture to the wall. That debt has been paid in full." In other words, we're now, 60-some years after the Civil War. We have voted for the Republican Party time and time and time and time again. But now we have already paid that debt. We don't owe anything else to the Republican Party. Now we can vote for the party that's going to help us. And the thought is it's going to be the Democrats that will help blacks in their struggle to find jobs. And so in 1934, majority of blacks are going to start voting for the Democratic Party. In 1936, 76% of black voters voted Democrat, which of course in the South, Southern whites are not real thrilled about, and Southern whites are going to have to find some way to keep blacks from voting, which again, we'll talk about later. There's always that push and pull, especially in the South, but throughout the entire country. Blacks saw the New Deal as racial justice. Reality of that, probably not true. The NRA, the National Recovery Act, had racial discrimination throughout the rules. The Tennessee Valley Authority, no blacks were allowed they had started a model town in Norris, Tennessee to show what could our cities look like in Tennessee, and no blacks were allowed in this ideal town in Norris, Tennessee. Because of this effort to get more people back to work, and certainly blacks are part of that, lynchings go up. Lynchings against blacks go up between 33 and 35. There were 57 lynchings throughout the South. And we've talked about the difference between lynchings and hangings. Hangings, of course, is you've done something wrong, you're convicted of a crime, and now that's your punishment. Lynching is, we found you, we're going to just string you up on this tree. I'm sorry for having to do that all the time, but my screen keeps going blank. I didn't set that properly. In 1935, the NAACP pushed for a national anti-lynching bill, which passed the House of Representatives, but it failed in the Senate. Mainly because Southern states said it went against the 10th Amendment. Southern states said, oh yeah, we would love to have an anti-lynching bill, but this is really a state issue, and so states should decide whether or not we should be able to have anti-lynching laws. So Southern states actually voted against this anti-lynching law. FDR appointed over 100 blacks to policy level positions, so all throughout the federal government, blacks are starting to find opportunities in the federal government. The highest ranking black in the federal government was Mary McLeod Bethune, M-C-L-E-O-D, Bethune, B-E-T-H-E-E-N-E. She was the Director of Minority Affairs for National Youth Administration. FDR also appointed an NAACP lawyer, William Hastie, H-A-S-T-I-E, to a federal judgeship. And after 37, when Roosevelt is able to appoint those 4 justices to the Supreme Court, we start to see more and more, maybe not civil rights, but more and more rulings in favor of voting rights, protecting voting rights, especially for minorities. No wage discrimination, jury selection is going to be changed. Oftentimes, especially in the South, if a black was on trial, you'd have an all-white jury, and almost 100% of the time, that defendant would be found guilty, even if the facts did not support that. As much as President Roosevelt tried to help with civil rights and issues for minorities, Mrs. Roosevelt was really the leader in doing that in the federal government. She had gone to a conference in the South which had segregated seating, so whites over here, blacks over here. And in order not to favor one side or the other, she sat right in the middle. And so, again, making that point that I'm not in favor of the whites, I'm not in favor of blacks, I'm trying to bring these two groups together. She was a member of a group called DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. And Daughters of the American Revolution, just a little background on this, are women whose ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. And so even today, if you have somebody in your family who fought in the Revolutionary War and you're a woman, you can be a member of DAR. The Daughters of the American Revolution, excuse me, refused to allow a black woman, Marian Anderson, permission to sing in their hall in Washington, D.C. And so Eleanor resigned from DAR, which was a big deal. Daughters of the American Revolution, very, very patriotic. And all of a sudden you have the First Lady of the United States resigning her position from the DAR. And she helped to get Marian Anderson a concert at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday. So a big concert in the middle of the Washington Mall. Blacks suffered even more during the Great Depression. We've already touched on that than whites. There's more unemployment, more homelessness, more malnutrition, more disease. By 1930, 50% of blacks lived in cities. Before 1930, most blacks lived on farms, but now they're moving into the cities to try to find work. The main reason, excuse me, the main reason why blacks are moving or moving away from especially southern farms because of the collapse of cotton prices as the Great Depression takes hold. Fewer things are being made out of all sorts of raw materials, but especially cotton. People are making their clothes last longer, and they are not buying new clothes because they just simply don't have money. And so cotton prices dramatically fell, and a lot of these blacks who had been farming on these cotton plantations had lost their jobs. Even if they stayed in the South, they are sharecroppers. They do not own, for the most part, they do not own their own land, and so they are not even going to be protected by programs such as the AAA. And so they are moving to the city to try to find jobs that just simply aren't going to be there. By 1940, 23% of the nation's 12 million blacks lived in the urban north. So we see a large percentage of, not the majority obviously, but a large percentage of the nation's blacks moving to the north. Again, that's going to raise social problems. As more and more blacks are moving to the north, whites are kind of saying in the north, listen, we really like black people as long as they stay in the south. But as soon as they become my neighbor, that's going to be a real issue. And so we are going to see continued increase in racial violence in northern cities. In Atlanta in 1930, whites organized, ironically, a group called the Black Shirts with a campaign slogan, "No jobs for niggers until every white man has a job." Now, please don't email me, "Dear Mr. Taylor, you shouldn't say that word in class." I know, I got it. But all right. So obviously, racism in the South has been around for a long, long time. It's almost institutionalized racism in the South. So the hope is if we move from the South to the North, maybe there's less discrimination. And many blacks found as they moved to the North, not a whole lot of less discrimination in the North. The Scottsboro case. In Scottsboro, Alabama, 9 black teenagers, and what had been going on in the 1930s is you have lots of people, just hopping on trains, going from one town to another, hopping on boxcars, going from one place to another, just simply trying to find work. And 9 black teenagers are just almost a joyride, getting on a train, and then hopping off of this train, and then they're arrested for vagrancy and disorder. Vagrancy is this idea of just kind of hanging out. You can't just hang out in front of Walgreens. You could be arrested for vagrancy laws. Now, vagrancy laws are only applied, they're not applied to everybody equally. I can hang out in front of Walgreens without a problem for hours probably. As teenagers, you probably cannot hang out in front of Walgreens for hours. Walgreens would probably call the police and say, hey, there's a bunch of teenagers hanging out in front of my store, and we need these people out of here. So you could be called on vagrancy laws. Later on, 2 women wound up, who had also been riding the train, accused these 9 teenagers of rape. Now, there's overwhelming medical evidence that these 9 teenagers did not commit the crime, did not commit rape against these 2 women. But the reason why these women probably brought these charges is, first of all, they were prostitutes, so they're not on the top of the social scale themselves, and they were probably afraid of also being arrested for vagrancy violations as well. And so they accused these 9 black teenagers of rape. An all-white jury sentenced 8 of the 9 teenagers to death. Well, it winds up going to the Supreme Court. In 1932, the Supreme Court overturns all the convictions. And what's kind of interesting about this case is that these 9 teenagers are defended by a group called the Internal Labor Defense Association. And the Internal Labor Defense Association is actually a communist organization. It's part of the Communist Party. And so the Communist Party is protecting these black teenagers. Keep that in the back of your mind. At the very end of chapter 24, that's going to become important. Hispanics, mostly of Mexican origin. During World War I, what's going to happen during World War I, we need more workers to work fields, and so we are going to invite Mexican workers into the United States. After World War I, these Mexican, mainly migrant workers who go from one farm to another, they don't own their own land, they are going to essentially stay in the United States, and they are going to grow in population. Well, and especially in California and in Texas. For the most part, they're filling very menial jobs. They're